That 30-second countdown. The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on 8 National Park Service bills. Under Committee Rule 4, subparagraph F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Without objection, the chair may also declare recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Members physically present today should provide a hard copy for staff to distribute by email. Please note that members are responsible for their own microphones, as with our fully in-person meetings. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff as soon as possible. I'll start by providing an opening statement, a brief one. I want to thank the sponsoring members of Congress as well as our witnesses for joining us today to speak about the personal and national significance of these proposals. This month is Great Outdoors Month, a wonderful time for us to celebrate our nation's parks, wildlife refuges, forests, monuments, national conservation lands, and other national treasures. Every day, Americans across our great country draw inspiration and pride from the beauty of our public lands. Our national parks have always been central to America's heritage and essential to our identity as a nation, as we know well back in Colorado. This committee has the responsibility to ensure that our federal counterparts have the tools that they need to maintain these iconic outdoor spaces and to tell the stories that shape our country. Today, we will consider 8 proposals that seek to enhance and strengthen our national parks and provide the resources that the National Park Service needs to address the challenges that they face today. We will consider a bill from the ranking member of the full committee, Chairman Westerman, that would reauthorize federal funding for the National Park Foundation through fiscal year 2030 and increase the authorization level from $5 million to $15 million. The National Park Foundation is an indispensable partner that has ensured the National Park Service can achieve its mission to protect our public lands and waters for present and future generations. I'm delighted that a fellow Coloradan, the president of the foundation, is here today to testify. And I'm also proud to be an original co-sponsor on Mr. Westerman's bill to protect and improve our national parks. We'll also consider legislation, including from several members of this subcommittee, that seeks to address challenges faced by the National Park Service. H.R. 1548, the National Plant Species Pilot Program Act, introduced by Representative Cartwright from Pennsylvania, would create a pilot program to utilize native plant materials in projects within the NPS regions to protect native plant biodiversity and direct the Park Service to review existing data and study the cost-effectiveness of using native plants. And we're delighted that Representative Cartwright is here to testify today. H.R. 1548 would enhance how the Park Service utilizes native plant materials for revegetation. Native plants require fewer pesticides and fertilizers, less water and maintenance, and they prevent the spread of invasive non-native species. H.R. 6442, the Pax Act, introduced by my colleague, Ranking Member Fulcher of this subcommittee, would expand the use of co-management agreements to include tribal governments and quasi-governmental entities to alleviate some administrative hurdles currently facing the National Park Service. H.R. 7615, introduced by committee member Representative Moore, seeks to remedy Park Service staffing shortages due to increased visitation to our national parks. The Lodge Act would provide the NPS with new authority to enter into new innovative housing partnerships with the private sector to provide a much-needed supply of housing in these high-demand regions and help NPS retain and hire staff. We'll also consider two bills that will honor those who played a role in shaping our national history. Introduced by Representative Lieu, H.R. 4658 would designate the Anthony Tony Beilenson Trailhead in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. As you all, I'm sure, are aware, Congressman Beilenson dedicated a significant amount of his time in Congress to environmental issues, including contributing to the formation of the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area, and certainly can think of no better way to honor his memory than to designate a trailhead with his namesake in the National Recreation Area that he fought so hard to establish. It also seems fitting that during National Caribbean American Heritage Month, we will hear a bill regarding a national park in the Virgin Islands. H.R. 7496 would direct the Secretary of the Interior to install a plaque at the peak of Ram Head in the Virgin Islands National Park to commemorate the slave rebellion that began on St. John in 1733. I want to thank Representative Plaskett for her leadership and for her efforts to ensure that our national parks tell important stories such as this one. Thank you again to the sponsoring members and the witnesses for being here today. I certainly look forward to hearing your testimonies, and again, grateful that we were able to put this hearing together in our continued effort to try to make sure that we are considering bills in a bipartisan way. Proud that the bills we're considering today include bills from the ranking member of the full committee, the ranking member of the subcommittee, rank and file members of this committee, and members from throughout the House. With that, I will yield back the balance of my time and recognize the ranking member for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you point out, today's bills deal with our nation's parks. Interestingly, this last weekend I had some relevant conversations with an Idaho family I've known for a long time. In recent years, this family has utilized their summer vacation time to visit a national park. This year, Yosemite was on their intended destination. But unfortunately, they had to cancel the trip and replace it with a family staycation because of a problem we're all facing right now: gas and food prices. I couldn't help but sense a disappointment and also wonder how many other families are having to make similar decisions, or worse yet, how many are not just canceling vacations, but rather going without necessities because they can't afford them. Before serving in Congress, I used to frequently travel to Europe for business. I would cringe when I would see the gas prices. Then I'd thank the good Lord that I lived in America, where resources were plentiful, industry technology was state-of-the-art, and by comparison, government policy allowed for reasonable access. But now, by our own doing, we have embraced policies that have resulted in a trade, prosperity for economic inflation, and product surpluses for product shortages. Gas is more than $5 a gallon, and inflation just hit a 40-year high of 8.6%. As we discuss these bills regarding parks, we must ask ourselves, what is the value if no one can go? And as important as our national parks are, our constituents, or at least mine in Idaho, aren't calling the office looking for help in this area. They're calling asking for help paying the gas bill. Instead of making policy changes that would solve the problems, congressional leadership has allowed the Biden administration to pause onshore and offshore leasing, canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, and impose a chilling effect on domestic energy production. The pipeline cancellation is notable because one of the majority leadership bills in today's hearing would authorize a natural gas distribution pipeline to cross through Valley Forge National Historic Park. The Keystone XL pipeline, which does not cross through any national parks, could help alleviate the current energy crisis. When the administration canceled the Keystone pipeline, Chairman of the Natural Resource Committee, Grijalva, welcomed the news of the termination and stated, "This is a win for the American people, and I will continue advancing forward-looking energy policies that will benefit our nation and spare communities and our environment from harm." Chairman Grijalva, we can't afford any more of your help. But if you really do believe that utilizing Congresswoman Dean's H.R. 7952 bill, which puts a pipeline in a national park unit, would spare our communities and environment from harm, the minority would be happy to re-engage in discussions favoring the Keystone XL pipeline. Anyway, the bills on today's agenda won't allow us to solve the challenges surrounding gas prices and inflation, but I do appreciate the majority, including my bill, H.R. 6442, the Pax Act, among those bills. The Pax Act will help the National Park Service reduce costs, share resources, and more efficiently tackle necessary deferred maintenance through the use of cooperative management agreements. These agreements would allow the Park Service to improve units without relying on taxpayer money. This is important because the Park Service recently announced that its deferred maintenance backlog increased by nearly 10 to 21.8 billion, despite receiving billions of dollars via the Great American Outdoors Act to address that very issue. This committee has the power to make important changes to the direction we are heading on domestic energy production and transmission. It's my hope that we will embrace the truth regarding the devastating problems caused by the Biden administration, and I thank you to the witnesses here today as well. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'd like to now turn to our witnesses. Before introducing them, I will remind non-administration witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the witness survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left, and then red when time is expired. For any members and witnesses joining remotely, it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining, and I recommend that you pin the timer on it so that it remains visible. The chair will now recognize the distinguished gentleman from Scranton, Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher, for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of two of my bills, H.R. 1548, the Native Plant Species Pilot Program Act, and H.R. 6364 to amend the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area Improvement Act to extend the exception to the closure of certain roads within the recreation area for local businesses. Each of these two bills is critical in its own way. I'll start this morning with 6364, legislation which would protect northeastern Pennsylvania's small businesses and our regional economy. As I'm sure members of this panel are aware, the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area stretches across Pennsylvania and New Jersey, preserving 70,000 acres on both sides of the Delaware River. Highway 209, which runs through Pennsylvania and New York, cuts directly through the middle of this national recreation area. Up until the 1980s, 209 was a heavily trafficked truck route. In 1981, the National Park Service, NPS, received jurisdiction over the section of 209 within the national recreation area, and in 1983, NPS prohibited all commercial traffic from using the federally owned highway, with one exception, for light commercial vehicles serving local businesses along the recreation area's boundaries. Without this exception, commercial traffic has very limited acceptable alternatives. Commercial vehicles based in places like Monroe and Pike counties would have to travel a minimum of an extra 10 miles to avoid the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. Local officials have supported this exemption, which has been reauthorized multiple times since its initial 30-year implementation. Unfortunately, the light commercial vehicle exemption lapsed in 2015 and in 2021. A one-year extension of the exemption is now in place, but it expires on September 30 this year. My bill, 6364, would restore the exemption for another 5 years instead of just one. Emergency vehicles, school buses, and commercial vehicles traveling from adjacent businesses would be allowed to utilize Highway 209 within the boundaries of the National Recreation Area toll-free. So on behalf of the entire Commonwealth, I would also like to thank my House co-lead, Congressman Dan Muser, as well as Senators Pat Toomey and Bob Casey, who are forwarding this very same measure in the Senate. This common sense legislation would go a long way toward minimizing economic disruptions and protecting local small businesses in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I am grateful to this subcommittee for considering it today. I am also very grateful for the opportunity to discuss another one of my bipartisan bills, the Native Plant Species Pilot Program Act, which is co-led by Congresswoman Stefanik here in the House, and led by Senators Collins and Cantwell in the Senate. There's good reason this bill has such broad support. Native plants are incredibly important to the preservation of our nation's natural resources. They provide food and shelter for local wildlife, and since they're adapted to local weather conditions, they require less water and maintenance than other non-native plants. They're also beneficial to the surrounding land through their natural properties that help control soil erosion, moderate floods, and filter water. But due to invasive species, temperature shifts, and land use change, almost 30% of the known native plant species in North America are at risk of extinction. That is why the bill we are discussing today is so important for my district and for our nation. This bill would establish a pilot program within the National Park Service to promote the use of native plants in land management activities on public lands. It would also study the cost effectiveness of using native plants in these land management activities, hopefully promoting their usage outside the pilot areas. So I thank you, Chair Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher, for your consideration of these important bipartisan and bicameral bills, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Cartwright, for being here today. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah, and a member of this committee, Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher, for holding today's hearing. I echo Representative Cartwright for also being able to have an opportunity to put forth good common sense legislation. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about the Lodge Act, which will improve housing options and affordability in and around our national parks. The members of this committee are no strangers to the incredible scenic landscapes across our nation. We all represent districts with those. According to estimates, 85% of Americans have visited a national park, and nearly 1 in 3 plan to visit a national park within the next year. Our national parks are not only beautiful places, but they are also major economic engines. The management of our lands can send ripple effects through our communities and economies. When lands are managed well, when agencies have the tools they need, and when communities are involved in the management process, our economies and environment can thrive. The inverse occurs when any one of these factors is ignored. Over the past few years, visitation rates at National Park Service units have increased significantly. In the last year alone, 44 units hit record high levels of visitation. In Utah, rates have gone up nearly 80% since 2011 alone. This has been a tremendous economic boon for many communities, urban and rural alike, in Utah. However, it has not come without consequences. While a surge in tourism is beneficial to local economies, it poses major challenges for housing options in national park communities and their neighboring areas. In recent years, we have seen a shift in the market as more and more property owners choose to engage in short-term rental services rather than leasing properties to the National Park Service and to private sector service employees. As a result, housing costs in many gateway communities have skyrocketed, displacing the employees who manage these places and keep our parks running. Employees are moving further and further away from their workplaces, which exacerbates the labor shortages and retention challenges already faced by the National Park Service. And since occupancy rates are so high, housing cannot be taken out of the inventory for necessary upgrades and improvements, which leads to lower quality housing. Today, we will have the opportunity to hear from witnesses who will outline some of the dramatic effects these conditions are having. To turn this situation around, I introduced the Lodge Act with my friend Congressman Panetta. This important bill will save taxpayers money while simultaneously improving the quality of our parks. By cutting red tape and streamlining processes, the Lodge Act will allow the National Park Service to enter into innovative public-private partnerships to meet housing needs in and around our parks. It is my hope that the new tools of this bill provides the National Park Service will allow for the unique needs of each park, its employees, and its visitors to be met and exceeded so that our parks can be properly managed. Thank you, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, for this opportunity. It is my hope that this bill will receive strong support in committee, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lieu.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher, for holding this hearing and for allowing me to speak in support of my legislation, H.R. 4658, the Beilenson Trailhead Designation Act. I am proud to have introduced this legislation alongside Congressman Adam Schiff. The Beilenson Trailhead Designation Act, if passed, will rename the Encinal Trailhead in Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area after former Congressman Anthony Tony Beilenson. As an elected official for 34 years, Congressman Beilenson represented the people of West Los Angeles, Santa Monica, Malibu, Westwood, Encino, Sherman Oaks, Canyon Country, and Calabasas for decades. Over the course of his career, he served in the California State Assembly, the California State Senate, and finally the House of Representatives from 1977 to 1997 when he retired. While serving in the California State Legislature, Congressman Beilenson was known for his dedicated legislative efforts on environmental protection, consumer protection, public health, and other important issues. While serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, Congressman Beilenson served on the Rules Committee and as chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence during the first Gulf War. He was dedicated to environmental issues, resulting in the passage of legislation to fund the formation of the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. Congressman Beilenson considered the designation of the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area to be his greatest legislative achievement and continues supporting the expansion of the area during his time as Congress until his death in 2017. It is for this reason I introduced H.R. 4658 to rename a trailhead in Congressman Beilenson's honor within the Santa Monica Mountains Recreation Area, which he was proud to have established. The Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area constitutes the nation's largest urban national park, protecting the beautiful Santa Monica mountain range. There are over 500 miles of trails through the recreation area. Like millions of others, I've enjoyed many hikes through the Santa Monica Mountains, and I will always be thankful that Congressman Beilenson helped protect this land for generations to come. I respectfully request the subcommittee to support H.R. 4658, the Beilenson Trailhead Designation Act, and I thank you again for the opportunity to testify before you.
The gentleman yields back, and thank you, Mr. Lieu, for testifying today. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the Pax Act is a piece of legislation that is all focused on simply allowing some cooperative agreements. And so much of this struggle that I think we have is just having all of the focus on the National Park Service to take care of these responsibilities. So what that simply does is it incentivizes a partnership between the National Park Service and state, local, and tribal entities so that they can work cooperatively together and makes that a legally admissible piece of leverage to do exactly that. PAX is an acronym, stands for Partnership Agreements Creating Tangible Savings. And to that end, it's just straightforward and simple. And that's the objective of it, is to try to involve public and private entities to do a better job of the overall management process and leverage that efficiency and effectiveness accordingly. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the distinguished gentlewoman from the Virgin Islands, Ms. Plaskett.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher. Thank you for the opportunity to present my views on H.R. 7496. This bill would direct the Secretary of the Interior to install a plaque at the peak of Ramhead Trail in the Virgin Islands National Park on St. John in the Virgin Islands of the United States to commemorate the slave rebellion that began on St. John in 1733. The plaque must include important facts about the fight against slavery, the collective suicide that occurred in the vicinity of Ramhead Peak during the rebellion of 1734, and the significance of the rebellion to the history of St. John, the Virgin Islands of the United States, and the United States of America. This bill is bipartisan, and I introduced it in partnership with our colleague, Congressman Guy Reichenthal of Pennsylvania. The Ramhead Trail, which includes Salt Pond Beach, is part of the Virgin Islands National Park on St. John. It's owned and managed by the National Park Service. In total, the trail is 2.3 miles round trip, culminating with a peak, and takes the average of an hour to complete. In 1733, an island-wide organized rebellion against slavery began on St. John. Harsh torture of enslaved people on St. John, even considered among the Caribbean colonies to be harsh, was likely the major motivation for the uprising, which had been planned out in advance in addition to other motivating factors such as drought and plague. The Slave Code of 1733 established new rules threatening brutal punishment for runaways. This led to an island-wide rebellion that lasted well into the next year. The Slave Rebellion on St. John was one of the earliest and longest-lasting organized fights for freedom in the Americas. It was eventually quelled, however, upon the arrival of reinforcements from Denmark, then the owner of the islands, and included support from other European nations, including the Spanish Armada. When this happened, numerous freedom-fighting slaves, including one of the rebel leaders, Brefu, committed suicide rather than return to slavery and punishment. The vicinity of the peak of Ramhead Trail on the island is a place of great significance to the people of the Virgin Islands regarding the history of the struggle, because notably during that struggle, a group of freedom-fighting slaves committed collective suicide at this location to escape returning to slavery. This is mainly why the peak of Ramhead Trail is an appropriate location to commemorate the island-wide fight for freedom on St. John. That is what is being commemorated with this plaque. It was an important and early part of the abolition movement in the Western Hemisphere, and it is an important event in the history of St. John, the Virgin Islands of the United States, and America. As such, visitors on Ramhead Trail should know this information and learn the historical significance of the location when they hike the trail. Mr. Reichenthal and Thaler and I feel strongly that it would be meaningful for visitors of the park and the trail to see an appropriate commemoration when they reach the top of the trail, which overlooks the island and the trail they have just completed. That is why this legislation directs installation of the plaque in the vicinity of the peak rather than at the beginning of the trail or elsewhere on the island, as it is the appropriate place of acknowledgement. My colleague and I have observed that currently there's no commemoration of what happened in the 18th century on St. John. Unlike anywhere else on the island, Ramhead Trail contains very little to no signage about the historic significance of the location or St. John generally. Our office has done due diligence in developing the legislation, met with National Park staff and others. We also have support from the Friends of the National Park of St. John, as well as from the legislature of the Virgin Islands. I ask unanimous consent to submit those into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. This legislative solution is appropriate and warranted upon consultation with Park Services and informed by my office that installation of the plaque would need to be prioritized to the highest levels of the Department of Interior because it represents a commemorative work. Therefore, it would be highly unlikely that a suitable plaque would be installed by administrative action. Therefore, the installation of the plaque at its high level of honor, and as Congress, we have the authority to provide this directive and ensure that it is executed in a timely fashion to be installed within 1 year of an enactment of the bill. This is also important because next year marks the 175th anniversary of our emancipation from slavery, and therefore would be an appropriate timeframe to do that. I'm asking for your support for this legislation and hoping that it would be unanimously brought forward to the floor. I ask for you all for your support, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on this very important issue to the people of the Virgin Islands.
Gentlewoman yields back. Thank you, Ms. Plaskett, for your important testimony. And I want to thank all of the members of Congress, not only for their testimony, but for introducing these very important bills. And certainly will do my part to do everything we can to get these bills to the floor. So we appreciate your leadership. We will now transition to our second panel. As with the first panel, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. The chair will now recognize one witness for purposes of this second panel, which is Ms. Lena McDowell, Deputy Director of Management and Administration of the National Park Service. Ms. McDowell, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chair Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to present the Department of the Interior's views on the 8 bills on today's agenda. I would like to submit our full statements for the record and summarize the department's views. H.R. 1548, the Native Plant Species Pilot Program Act of 2021, would create a pilot program to utilize native plant materials in projects within MPS units to protect native plant biodiversity. The bill complements how the MPS utilizes native plant materials in projects throughout the service. The department supports H.R. 1548 and would like to work with the sponsor and the subcommittee to address technical edits regarding the implementation of the bill. H.R. 4658 would recognize the contributions that former Representative Anthony Beilenson made toward the creation and protection of the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area by naming the Encinal Trailhead on the Backbone Trail in the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area after him. The department supports H.R. 4658 and recommends amending the bill so that the name used for the trailhead is consistent with the name used for the Santa Monica Mountains Anthony C. Beilenson Interagency Visitor Center. H.R. 6364 would extend the authority of the MPS to allow commercial vehicles serving local businesses to use Federal Road 209 within Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. The current authority expires in September of this year, and this bill would extend the authority through September 30, 2026. The department supports H.R. 6364. H.R. 6442 would expand the MPS's authority to enter into cooperative management agreements, which enable the MPS to share goods and services with neighboring state and local parks. This bill would allow the MPS to enter these agreements with a broader range of entities, including tribal governments and quasi-governmental entities. It would also remove the requirement that the cooperating agency be adjacent to the MPS unit. Expanding this authority would allow the MPS to provide valuable educational programs, visitor services, infrastructure support, and historic preservation more efficiently. The department supports H.R. 6442 and would like to work with the bill's sponsor and the subcommittee on several amendments to refine the bill. H.R. 7496 would direct the Secretary of the Interior to install a plaque within Virgin Islands National Park to commemorate the slave rebellion that began on St. John on November 23, 1733, in an appropriate location at the peak of Ram Head. The department supports H.R. 7496 and believes strongly in the importance of promoting public knowledge and understanding of the 1733 uprising and its significance in the movement to end slavery throughout the Western Hemisphere. However, we recommend that H.R. 7496 be amended to provide more flexibility in the means of commemorating and interpreting this story. H.R. 7615 would provide additional authorities to the Secretary of the Interior to partner with governments, housing entities, or other organizations for the purposes of developing, constructing, rehabilitating, or managing housing for federal employees and members of the public on and off public lands. The NPS recognizes that meeting its housing needs will require multiple approaches. However, we want to approach any changes thoughtfully to ensure all factors and future impacts are considered. The department supports the goals of H.R. 7615 and would like to work with the sponsor and the subcommittee to refine the bill. We believe more detail is needed in some provisions to ensure potential partnerships meet the needs of our national parks and the nation's taxpayers. H.R. 7693 would increase the annual authorization of appropriations to the National Park Foundation, enacted in 2016, from $5 million to $15 million, and extend the authority for this funding from fiscal year 2024 through fiscal year 2030. The MPF was established by Congress in 1967 as the official nonprofit philanthropic partner of the MPS. NPS philanthropic partners, including the MPF, provide ways for individuals, corporations, and private foundations to make contributions to help conserve and preserve the natural, cultural, and historical values of the national parks for the enjoyment of future generations. The department supports the extension of the authorization of appropriations to the MPF and looks forward to working with Congress to ensure continued support for the MPS in alignment with priorities set forth in the President's budget. H.R. 7952 authorizes the Secretary of the Interior to issue a right-of-way permit for the relocation of existing covered pipeline segment in conjunction with the proposed realignment of Valley Forge Road and North Gulf Road within Valley Forge National Historical Park. The department supports H.R. 7952. Chair Neguse, this concludes my statement. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for your testimony. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3, subparagraph D, imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses, or rather the witness. in this case. And I'll start with the dean of my delegation, recognizing Representative DeGette for 5 minutes if she has any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a good Colorado presence here today, and I'm delighted to be here. All of these bills, one of the great things about this subcommittee is we have such varied issues that come before us, and I always appreciate the administration coming in and talking about what they care about. I want to talk first about the National Park Foundation Reauthorization Act, because I think this is such a key institution in partnership with the National Park Service. It really builds on, the agency really builds on the work of the National Park Service by helping feed in some of the issues that we really need work with. And I wanted to ask you, Director McDowell, about that, because I think these partnerships that we have with organizations are so important to the management of our public lands and to our Park Service. So I wanted to ask you, in your experience, what contributions and activities of the National Park Foundation have the greatest impact to the Park Service and the ability to achieve its mission?
Sorry about that. Thank you for that question. I think there are a number of areas where the contributions have been significant. I think the first example is clearly the work that was done during the Centennial Campaign, where the foundation raised over $500 million to support park priorities. They have done a lot of work with the larger partner community to increase the capacity of over 400 other partners that work with parks around the country. They've contributed almost $700,000 to promoting capacity in those areas, and those groups have collectively raised, I think, around $600 million since 2018. So they've really helped to extend the reach of the larger partner community. They've also done a significant amount of work with our service corps, supporting close to 130 of those corps since 2018. And there are lots of other examples that I could talk about, but I think one of the new areas that's kind of exciting that we're working with them on are things to look at the future of parks and what kinds of services we provide to visitors. So I do think there are a lot of things that we could talk about in this arena.
And I think it'd probably be fair to say, given the limitations of the federal budget, if we didn't have because all of these contributions that you're talking about are private contributions that they raise, they're matched, I believe, one-on-one by the federal budget, but this is money in addition to whatever we could possibly afford to spend on our national parks. Is that right?
Yes, private contributions are in addition to what we are able to do with appropriations.
Right. So we may not be able to do this planning or many of these other activities if we didn't have the private contributions of the foundation.
Correct.
Thank you. I want to ask you just another question about one of the other bills, and that's the Pax Act, because the Pax Act specifically focuses on the National Park Service's relationship with tribal governments and quasi-governmental entities. So as we're working to protect our environment, I think everybody said that it's important that we make sure that we incorporate diverse and often overlooked voices as we identify problems. You talked about that in your testimony. I'm wondering, last month NPS Director Sams testified the National Park Service is committed to strengthening the role of tribal communities in the co-management of our federal lands. Can you talk to us about some of the concrete ideas that the agency has for incorporating this and how the Pax Act can help with that?
So the Pax Act, by expanding our authority to work with tribes, allows us to involve them in management of federal lands in ways that we have not easily been able to before in a wide range of park activities. So you think of interpretation and education, there could be opportunities to share staff. There are specific examples of parks that have relationships with tribes that have cultural affinity for the area. Boston National Harbor. There are the Massachusetts tribe is culturally affiliated with that particular site, and there are opportunities for having more involvement in park activities. Grand Canyon, there are 11 tribes that are associated with Grand Canyon, and the park is working closely with them on a variety of activities where there could be possible sharing of staff or ideas to provide park operations, essentially.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Fulcher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. McDowell for being here and for your testimony, and I appreciate Congresswoman DeGette's question on the Pax Act. That was one of the questions I was going to ask, but you already answered that. But moving on to a different one, I don't know if you read the Washington Post, and I'm certainly not suggesting that you do. However, they did publish a survey recently that found that with gas prices of over $5 a gallon, they found that 6 in 10 Americans had considered that a major factor in determining their summer vacation plans. And that's even maybe relevant because that's more than twice what the same response was to COVID-19. And in my own state, those prices are even higher than the national average. So we're certainly feeling that. Have you done any projections at all for visitation, given the situation that is out there right now for the parks? Any projections?
So I don't have the answer to that question, but I would be happy to take it back and provide it for the record.
So as you do that, would you also take a look at perhaps the response to the results that you find, and then measure that with lower income Americans too? Because oftentimes our national parks it's a relatively cost-effective way to go about your summer vacation. So I would ask you to do that. And then will you respond back to us at the committee?
We would be happy to try to answer those questions.
Okay, thank you. Moving along to Representative Dean's bill. This is the one that authorizes NPS to provide right-of-way for a natural gas pipeline to cross through the boundaries of the Valley Forge National Historical Park. Are you in support of that?
Yes, the department does support that bill.
And so is it also true that the department supports the current administration's position on the Keystone Pipeline?
So I can only speak for the National Park Service, and we don't have responsibility for decisions like that, but I would be happy to.
Do you support that decision?
I can only speak for the National Park Service.
So speak for the National Park Service and tell me if you support that position.
I can't answer that question. I'm very sorry. We would be happy to
So you can
respond
see
to it later.
that there's a disparity there, okay? And so that's why you were instructed not to speak to that, is because there is a disparity that you really can't explain. And so if you're wondering where that directive came from, now you know why. Moving on, 2012, the National Park System Advisory Board recommended a partnership management to address many of the challenges the agency has. And the quote from that came, "The future should not be about doubling the amount of land owned by NPS. Instead, it should look into increasing the impact of NPS by enabling the service to do much more through affiliations and partnerships." Do you believe that the NPS, the National Park Service, is on a sustainable trajectory right now?
I think there are a number of challenges related to the responsibilities that we have and the resources that we have to address them. It's why a number of the bills we're talking about today help expand our reach and help us involve a wider variety of organizations in accomplishing those goals.
So is that you think that, does that translate to, is that sustainable?
I think we always have to calibrate what we do with what we have.
Okay. Again, thank you for just taking the time. You can tell that there's some gaps and there's some concerns that we've got, and we need you and we appreciate your work. But I would encourage you to not just stick to whatever the directive is on what you're told to say, and actually think through some of these things and be able to respond, because the policy and the decision and the sustainability of the service depends on that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will recognize Mr. Gallego from it for 5 minutes, but before I do, just to make sure I clarify something that I don't think the witness indicated that she was instructed not to answer anything. So she's happy to clarify that perhaps in the rest of the questioning that'll ensue here, but she's here to testify on the position of the agency on these 8 bills. But in any event, I'll yield to, or recognize rather, my colleague from Arizona, Mr. Gallego, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That'll be easier. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. McDowell, thank you for being here today. I have a couple questions for you. First, I'm glad that we're considering a Native Plant Species Pilot Program Act. I've been very proud to lead a letter during the last 2 appropriation cycles supporting funding for a variety of threatened and endangered species recovery programs, including a BLM plant conservation and restoration program. The use of native species to protect biodiversity was explicitly mentioned in our letter this year, and we know that especially in Arizona, it's invasive species, and actually invasive grass that actually starts a lot of the wildfires that have been devastating the West, particularly, I would say, at least Arizona. I can't speak for other states. There's also some research that shows that if we actually replant, we could actually bring down the intensity of these fires. And as Arizona and much of the country is seeing longer and harsher fire seasons, it's important that we take every step that we can to prevent fires, including the use of these types of plants. In what ways NPS already prioritizing the utilization of native plant species for projects as a best practice? And how would HR 1548 further that objective?
Great. Thank you for that question. So our management policies do promote the use of native plant species in a number of ways to restore degraded areas for education and interpretation. And in our project design and contract specifications for a variety of projects, we do require the use of native seeds and container plants with pretty limited exceptions. So the park system units promote use of native plant materials with things like in-house greenhouses and seed storage facilities, and through contracts and agreements with partners, and by working with other partners to obtain native plant materials for these types of restoration activities. One limiting factor that is often the availability of some of these native plant species, and this pilot program would help address that. The bill facilitates coordination with other federal agencies and partners and will help us to develop and acquire native plant materials and implement more restoration projects.
In what process would the National Park Service use to determine which regions the pilot program in HR 1548 would be instituted? Like, how do you target, basically?
So we would assess needs through a series of, pilot program proposals, and we would evaluate those against a set of criteria. That would include things like the number of parks they would support, anticipated effectiveness, whether or not they are able to increase native plant material availability, and how well they coordinate with other agencies and partners.
Thank you. It's another thing, so I've been now on this committee for 7, close to 8 years, and one of the things that I think is really important is making sure that the diversity of the country understands that the National Park Service is also for them, that they know that they can go, they can use it to, visit, also they could go camping, everything else like that. Being from Arizona, we're 30% Latino, but I would say that the amount of Latinos that understand that they should go camping, they can go camping, they can go visit these beautiful sites, is very limited, just because they come from countries where they don't have necessarily as established park services. As a matter of fact, a lot of some of the most beautiful areas in Latin America are actually usually privately owned. So the idea of them even going to visit that is kind of, it's a weird thing. So when here the concept of seeing beautiful places and the fact that they have access to it is something that we have to unfortunately explain, because they should have access to it. So I'm just wondering, what are you considering? Today we're considering HR 7496, which is to install a plaque at the peak of Ram Head in the Virgin Islands to really start talking about diversity and for people to actually understand that that's a really good example, that area was to commemorate the slave rebellion. Are we doing projects like that in other parts of the country to make sure that people know that this is an accepting place and they should come and learn about their history and this be part of their history?
Well, I am not prepared to talk about specific examples, but certainly the Park Service has a very high priority on expanding the kinds of stories that we tell, ensuring that the stories of all Americans are being told in these places and that all Americans feel welcome and comfortable at these sites. We would be happy to provide you with some more specific examples as a follow-up.
No, I just think it's important that we have as many sites like that all over the country because it's a great way to bring people into these sites that maybe have not seen them before, also connect them to the history there. I took my son to Montezuma's Castle recently in Arizona, and he loved it, and I sat there and I explained to him, well, I explained to him, I just read the plaque because I'm not that smart. But thank you, he doesn't read, so he thinks I am that smart. But it was a really great way that for me to connect with him and for him to connect with his native Arizona that I don't think I could have done any other way. So I think it's really important for you guys to kind of continue those types of programs.
That's great. We love hearing stories like that.
Gentleman yields back. We all think you're very smart. But next time, you got to wear a tie to this committee. Very high standards.
You only say that because you want my vote, but I appreciate it.
The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Westerman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse and Ranking Member Fulcher. Chairman Neguse, I also want to thank you for including in the hearing a bill that I co-sponsored, the National Park Foundation Reauthorization Act of 2022, and because of a prior commitment, I was unable to be here for the opening statement, but I would request I can submit that statement to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Deputy Director McDowell, thank you for being here today. I sent a letter to the department on the deferred maintenance backlog and implementation of the Great American Outdoors Act, which has been placed in front of you for your reference. We requested answers to the questions in this letter by May 30th, but have yet to hear back. When can we expect to hear a response from this letter?
So I am not familiar with that letter. I have to apologize, but I would be happy to follow up on it as soon as this hearing is over.
Thank you. We would like to follow up on that as well. Since we sent that letter and we haven't received a response, I'll just ask some of the questions in the letter today. Number one, can you please explain why the National Park Service's backlog increased by nearly $10 billion since you last reported these numbers, despite the fact that you've received billions of dollars through the Great American Outdoors Act?
So the Park Service has made some changes in how the number is calculated, particularly to ensure that we are reflecting the full cost of some of these projects, including planning and design. There are probably other reasons as well that I don't have the details on today, but I would be happy to follow up with a precise example, which I believe you've probably asked in this letter.
Yeah, I would be interested to see that. I know I visited Yellowstone before the Great American Outdoors Act was passed, and I was astonished at the estimates being used there, like $800 per square foot to renovate a building, $1 million a mile to make the shoulder wider on the 2-lane roads out there. The numbers seemed extraordinarily high earlier, and I know even though with all the inflation and increased prices, I'm still concerned that this number's increased this high. So what criteria does the agency currently use to select projects, and why did the agency allocate over $100 million to a project in Speaker Pelosi's district?
I'm not prepared to answer that question, but I would be happy to provide an answer for the record.
We would really like to see that. And why isn't the agency devoting more resources to maintenance action teams which target projects in smaller parks and provide a more direct benefit to visitors' experiences? You know, in supporting the Great American Outdoors Act, my understanding was we were going to take this funding and we were going to spread it across the country, and small parks and facilities like I have in my district were going to get some of that funding. But why aren't you devoting more of the resources to the maintenance action teams?
We would be happy to follow up with an explanation.
So does the agency have any plans to increase transparency with the status of the projects that are funded under the Great American Outdoors Act?
I am not prepared to answer questions about Great American Outdoors Act, but we would be happy to respond with some more information. I do believe that we aim for transparency in how those projects are selected and how they're going.
So the $10 billion increase, is there a report or a file we can look at to see how you came up with the increase of $10 billion to the maintenance backlog?
I'm not sure if there's a report, but we would be happy to follow up with information that clarifies how that number increased and why.
And are there any kind of reports that show which projects are being funded and the criteria that was gone through? I know a lot of money has been spent right here around Washington, D.C., and I can promise you my constituents back home and across the country, when they think of restoring our parks, they're not thinking about the expressway around Washington, D.C. and spending an enormous sum of money there or an enormous sum of money in Speaker Pelosi's district. So I would really like to see some transparency, see an accounting of how you make the decisions to distribute that money, and what criteria were actually used, and why the small parks and smaller sites are being left out of the equation, when I think it would be beneficial to the administration to actually show the American public that they care about rural America, where most of these parks are located. So I'm anxious to see the answers to that letter. I hope they will be sooner than later. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you for your questions.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now, well, I don't see Ms. Talib on the screen. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of, I don't have 5 minutes of questions. I would just simply say a couple things. First, thank you, Ms. McDowell, for testifying today. I think the ranking member raises a couple of questions with respect to some budgetary matters of the NPS that are important questions. And so I'm certainly interested in the answers as well. And perhaps, they could give rise to a more general oversight hearing with the NPS, which is something I certainly support. I do want to clarify, just for purposes of the rest of the remaining time that this particular witness will have before this committee, that Ms. McDowell, my understanding is you are not a political appointee. You are a civil servant, a part of the civil service system within the National Park Service. You have been there for some time. You worked there during the administration of Barack Obama, of Donald Trump, of Joe Biden, and you are not here to testify on general matters regarding the NPS, but rather the 8 particular bills, 3 Republican bills, 5 Democratic bills that are being considered by the committee today. If I sum that up?
That is my understanding. Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because again, it's not to suggest members obviously have the ability to, ask any questions they would like, but I want to make sure we're clear on expectation setting in terms of the knowledge that this particular witness would have to answer some of the more general questions.
Will the gentleman yield?
In one moment, I do think it's important to relay back to the agency and to the Director of Management Administration, to your superior, the need for the agency to timely respond to any letters that are propounded by this committee, whether it's the majority or the minority. I'm happy to yield to the gentleman.
And I just wanted to add to what you said, Chairman, that in no way did my questioning mean to reflect on your service. I appreciate the work that you do, but I do hope you will push those questions up to the people who can answer them, because we really do want to know the answers to that.
Absolutely, and I'm very happy to do that. I think they would be happy to have the conversation.
Thank you.
And with that, I would just simply say, I also hope you'll relay back to your team, the staff that you work with, Ms. McDowell, our gratitude for their technical assistance on these bills. This committee, as we near the end of the 117th Congress, this subcommittee has been a particularly busy committee. It's a very voluminous legislative agenda. I suspect, we haven't looked at the data, but I suspect it's probably one of, if not the busiest subcommittee in the entire House. In terms of getting bills to the floor, a lot of members on both sides of the aisle who have, ideas, some great ideas, some not so great ideas, in terms of ways in which to change. No, I'm not, it's not a partisan matter. I'm just saying, members' passions, right, around our public lands. And so as a result, I know we put a great deal of stress on the agency in terms of all the requests that we make for technical assistance and insight on the bills that we're considering. And so I hope you will relate to the team back at NPS our gratitude, and we will probably continue to keep you busy over the course of the next 6 months, but I want to make sure that we register that gratitude. With that, I will yield back the balance of my time, and will recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say to the majority, some of these questions are coming, and Ms. McDowell, and it's no criticism of Ms. McDowell, if there's answers that you know are probably going, or questions that are going to be answered, shouldn't we be prepared? And if there needs to be other people in attendance here to be able to answer these questions, I don't think that there would be anything wrong with that.
Would the gentleman yield to the chair to clarify? I'll give you your time.
Briefly, okay.
Yeah, I would just, and I'll make sure we preserve your time. It's just this, the purpose of this particular hearing is a legislative hearing on those 8 bills. So I don't, the witness that comes forward is to testify on those 8 bills. I hear what you're saying regarding the more general questions, and I think there should be an oversight hearing with NPS where you can have a general witness that testifies to all the questions that you're posing. But I'll yield back and certainly preserve your 30 seconds there.
I want to thank Representative Dean for putting this bill forward today. I don't remember the number. In regards to upgrading a pipeline, I give her great credit for doing that, and it's a good thing that she's doing it. Does the Department of Interior support other pipeline upgrades?
I can only speak on behalf of the National Park Service and speak generally about how we handle pipelines. They're on an individual basis. They're evaluated, one by one on their merit. So I cannot speak, unfortunately, to the department's policy.
To the chairman of this committee, does the chairman of the full committee support this Valley Forge proposal by Representative Dean?
I have no idea. I don't speak for the chairman. So we can certainly find an answer to that question. But
So I'm assuming that he does. I've seen him use very strong language in imposing pipelines, including Keystone. And recently, he and a representative from California came out and said the American Petroleum Institute needs to be investigated for the actions they've been taking. I'm just wondering how about the green non-governmental organizations? Shouldn't they be investigated also? Because we're hearing and getting some data that there are Russian dollars flowing into some of these green NGOs that stand before this committee and they advocate. Do you know, does the administration support the improvement of Line 5, both in northern Wisconsin, where I live, and in Ashland County? Do you know if the administration supports that?
I am not familiar with that issue, but I would be happy to take the question back.
That'd be great. There's a major pipeline reroute that would go around a reservation, an Indian reservation in northern Wisconsin. It was requested that they reroute, and they are doing that. That permit is languishing on the governor of Wisconsin's desk. It'd be nice if this administration could get it done if they gave the signal. Do you know, does the administration support the improvement of the line through the Mackinac Straits over in northern Michigan?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that issue either, but I would be happy to take that back.
That'd be terrific. I think it's a $2 billion project to improve safety through the Mackinac Straits. Remember, this Line 5 that runs across northern Wisconsin, Michigan, goes over to Canada, feeds the upper Midwest. My understanding, it carries about 20% of the petroleum liquids in America. It is hugely important, and yet we have the administration, and in this case, Representative Dean, saying that, boy, we should make sure we get this pipeline done because it's important that goes through Valley Forge, but how about the rest of America? We're hearing crickets, nothing there. So America needs all ways possible to be able to get energy, including this Valley Forge project. I would just highlight for this committee a story that just came out on a local television station, Wausau, Wisconsin, WAOW. An energy grid operator for the first time is warning state power companies there might not be enough electricity this summer. Think about it. For the first time, they have the regional grid operator has put out the warning, and unanimous consent to enter this into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Yeah, thank you very much. So think about it. Energy in all of its forms is becoming more scarce here in America. I think about my district also burns a lot of propane, a lot of rural customers, and use propane. We went from 80 cents a gallon in August of 2020 when I first came into this body, and we're now up over $2 a gallon for those users. It is becoming becoming extremely expensive for people to be able to heat their homes, drive their cars, and all the rest. And it's terrific that we're seeing this proposal by Representative Dean to upgrade a pipeline project this committee as a whole should be advocating for this in a far greater manner, including Keystone and other pipeline segments like I mentioned. Otherwise, America's going to run out of energy, and we will be begging the Saudis to drill for more oil because we don't produce it right here in America. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ranking Member Fulcher for putting this together. Yep, good. Okay. First, I'd like to comment on the severe weather and damage that's taking place in Yellowstone Park right now. Our thoughts and prayers go out to Superintendent Shawley and everyone who may be stuck within the park. We've got the most severe flooding that's taking place right now that has been since 2011, and there's some major destruction that's taken place on some of the infrastructure and obviously natural features that everyone does go to the park to visit. So our thoughts and prayers are with everyone there. Ms. McDowell, I really do appreciate you coming in today, and I understand the probably fairly uncomfortable position that it's put you in because of everybody here, but we're just, if you can convey a lot of this information
definitely
back,
do that.
obviously that's going to be a big, big help to us. Each one of these issues that were brought forward, so we'll go to the legislation, of course, to implement them, it costs a lot of money, and they're basically the priorities of this administration. They have, set forth, and that is well within this administration's prerogative. The real issue is, though, that there's only a certain amount of dollars that are available to implement that. So clearly, if we had more revenue available, that would make it much easier for us to make this investment, would it not?
Certainly more revenue or more funding is helpful in a variety of circumstances.
Exactly, and basically, we have tried in this committee to find alternative ways that we could generate that revenue while still enhancing the ability for everyone to visit these parks. Because as my friend from Arizona stated, this is a unique situation within our country that a lot of other places have, where everyone from across the country can go out and enjoy, these properties and see wildlife and see these natural features that other countries just don't avail themselves to. And so what we don't want to do is make the user pay situation so extreme that people just cannot afford to visit it. Would you agree with that?
We do aim to keep rates reasonable.
Exactly. That being said, could we get your support in pressing the administration? And I understand that you don't make the policy issues, but I'm asking for just your support to press the administration to honor the court orders calling for the continued oil and gas leasing of the federal public lands outside of the parks. We're not talking about park lands now. We're talking about the properties that are federally owned that have these resources on them in order to provide adequate funding to the Great American Doors Act, which would support all of these projects.
So again, I can only speak for the Park Service, and I can't,
But you can speak for yourself, Ms. McDowell. Can I get your support
I
in
am
pressing
happy-
the administration?
I am happy to take back the sentiment.
Because if I can begin at the most basic levels of people that, again, are not affiliated with the administration, you are affiliated with the Park Service. And if the Park Service recognizes that keeping the fees low is a priority, and if the Park Service recognizes that we have this tremendous backlog of maintenance that needs to be done, and if the Park Service recognizes that we need to start putting some contingency plans in place because there's also several millions of dollars worth of damage that has just taken place as we are holding this hearing right now, could I not get your support as a Park Service employee to help us push the administration to benefit all of us?
So I am here to speak for the administration. So again, I am happy to take back your comments and any of your questions.
Okay, well, that's where we need to go, okay? We have funding available. It's a stream that would be consistent, but it's not going to be consistent if the administration continues to halt the oil and gas leases and then continues to halt the issuance of permits so that we can develop those resources on those very lands that would generate the revenue that would directly help us to make those improvements on the infrastructure so that everyone in the country can continue to enjoy those facilities. Thank you.
Thanks.
I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes, and with my apologies, Mr. Heiss, for the snafu on the sequencing there. No, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No problem, and I appreciate you recognizing me. And Dow, also want to thank you for being here today. I am admittedly a bit stunned at your lack of preparedness for basic questions that are coming your way, either lack of preparedness or outright refusal to answer some questions that should be answered. And frankly, I can't understand why you're even here today by not answering some of these questions. And these need to be answered, and we expect answers. And I am extremely disappointed with your presence in that regard this morning. But Mr. Chairman, I'll just take a couple of moments to express some basic thoughts. I recognize that many of the bills that we're discussing today have merit overall, but I do at the same time believe that we are missing the greater point and the problems that many Americans are facing. I've got some stats here with some of the national parks attendance. Back in 2019, there were 327 million individuals who visited our national parks. That was a third all-time highest number of people visiting our parks. As of last year, that number had dropped to 297 million. That was still equivalent to the sixth highest period of time, but obviously a significant decline of some 30 million people. I think we can give the pandemic some credit for that. I understand that kind of decline, but currently we are still expecting declines, and we're not even dealing with the real issue as to why. Look, Americans are suffering under horrible economic policies and decisions by this administration, while inflation is going up and up and up, 8.6% now. At the same time, we are watching gas prices going sky high. In fact, 82% of Americans are outwardly stating that the rise of gas prices are the primary reason why they're not traveling. And yet we're not dealing with any of this. As of this morning, the average price of a gallon of gasoline across the country is over $5 a gallon. In some parts of the country, over $8 a gallon, which is beyond minimum wage. And we're not even addressing these type of things. In March, nearly 70% of adult Americans were limiting their summer travels because they can't afford gasoline. They can't afford the destructive results of inflation that drastically impacts the affordability of their everyday lives. This is the reason why we are watching a decline of people traveling to our national parks and our great American landmarks. This is the type of thing that we need to be addressing and talking about in this committee. We should be spending our time focusing on legislation that actually addresses the problems that the American people are facing. And while we are turning a blind eye to these type of things is irresponsible to me and inexplainable, not only to me, but to the American people. I think it's time for Congress to stop wasting taxpayer dollars and stop losing the trust of the American people by having hearings on things that are not addressing the issues of concern that the American people are dealing with. And so with these couple of thoughts, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. I do appreciate you recognizing me, and I, with that, yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I thank the gentleman. I would simply note that Half of the bills today are Republican bills and half are Democratic bills, so I don't see those Republican bills that have been introduced as wasting time, but I will yield I'll recognize the gentleman from Utah, who's the author of one of the bills we're considering today, Mr. Moore. For 5 minutes, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair, Ranking Member. Ms. McDowell, thank you for being here. Thanks for joining us today. I appreciate your insights into affordable housing challenges the National Park Service faces. And it is my sincere hope that one of those bills we're introducing today, the Lodge Act, can help alleviate many of these issues. One of the most significant challenges we face in Utah is the maintenance backlog, particularly on our public lands. Can you describe for us how the Lodge Act and our efforts to improve housing conditions for Park Service employees can help with the maintenance backlog in our nation's parks?
So it expands the range of possible partner opportunities that we could use to provide housing without necessarily having to do things the traditional way where we build a building that is then federal responsibility permanently, that we then struggle to care for. It allows us to partner with other organizations or other government agencies and quasi-government agencies that may be facing similar challenges as the Park Service. We can join forces. There are opportunities for us to cooperate on facilities off public lands, so it greatly expands our flexibility in dealing with the housing challenge without necessarily having to increase or worry about increases in the deferred maintenance backlog later on.
Do the partnership opportunities, does that go into, like, specifically to backlog, like maintenance backlogs? I know the housing capabilities that will allow for, but with respect to a maintenance backlog, does that also provide an alleviation on getting some of that stuff taken care of? Because it's a big issue for Utahns across the board.
So I would have to go back and provide you with some more detailed information on whether there's some specific partnerships that they are considering that will directly deal with the maintenance backlog, but I know indirectly this does provide opportunities for us to avoid further backlog in the future.
I think the part that I like about this is its ability to improve to hire and retain staff, and along that process can get to some of those issues. Additionally, Ms. McDowell, crowding in and around our parks is a pressing issue that we'll need to carefully evaluate in the coming years. How do you think the Lodge Act and its effect on living conditions will improve the overall experience enjoyed by visitors to our parks?
Well, certainly having better housing, more housing allows us to keep seasonal numbers up, to retain seasonals, to continue to attract seasonal staff, and those staff are critical in our ability to provide those visitors with the services that they're looking for.
I always have obviously a tilt towards things that are important to Utah in legislation. I think that most representatives should always be focused on that, and we're co-sponsoring this with my Democrat friend from Central Valley, Carmel, California, Mr. Panetta. Expanding that out, this doesn't just affect Utah and California. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, it affects a wide variety of areas around the country, urban and rural. We look at the cost of housing in some of our urban areas, and then in some of our more rural parks where those communities have become very popular places or are very popular places to vacation. The vacation rental industry has certainly impacted the availability of housing in those locations, even if it were affordable. So it is a problem that we see in a wide variety of locations.
One of the things the Lodge Act would do, in layman's terms, would cut red tape and reduce costs to the National Park Service. Are you aware of any other provisions or any specifics you'd like to highlight in the law that could improve operations that the Park Service is unable to or reluctant to fully utilize due to limitations in the statute?
So I believe one of the areas is that it expands the types of organizations we can work with. It also allows us to have non-federal employees or non-Park Service employees in housing facilities, which allows us to more effectively share cost. Those are some of the reasons why some of these potential partnerships under a current authority have not really been able to pencil out, is that it didn't really fit the circumstance of the partnership that we were trying to create.
Awesome. I'll just close briefly with Utah is a place that really does try to find solid, workable solutions to create better outcomes. We do it across the board. We have I serve on natural resources and armed services. We have really unique best practices that we engage on the defense community that should be used and utilized across our country. I just implore this committee, Ms. McDowell, and the National Park Service to look to Utah for opportunities to show best practices and how we can improve this going forward. This bill is solid, and I hope that we can create better outcomes going forward.
Thank you. We
Thank you.
appreciate
Go
that.
back.
Gentleman yields back. Excellent questions. Let's not forget about Colorado. But with that, let me say thank you to the witness again for your valuable testimony. We very much appreciate it. And the members for all of their questions. We will now transition to our third panel.
Thank you.
As with the first two panels, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be made part of the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I'll also allow the entire panel to testify before we proceed with questions. The chair, I know we're taking a minute here to get readjusted here. Well, hold on one moment. Great. All right, the chair will recognize our first witness who's joining us virtually, Ms. Karen Gilhooly, Chair of National Affairs and Legislation for the Garden Club of America. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I'd like to thank Chair Grijalva for the invitation to join you today, and Ranking Member Westerman, Chair Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and Representatives Cartwright and Stefanik for your leadership on HR 1548, the Native Plant Species Pilot Program Act. My name is Karen Gilhooly, and I'm the chair of the National Affairs and Legislation Committee of the Garden Club of America, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with 18,000 volunteers all across the country. Our purpose is to restore, improve, and protect the quality of the environment, and we've been speaking up in defense of the importance of plants as part of a healthy, balanced ecosystem for over 100 years. It's my pleasure to represent the GCA today to speak on behalf of native plants in particular and to encourage strong support of this bill. We appreciate the ongoing collaboration we have with so many of our members of Congress in developing effective policy and legislation that protects our natural world. We are all very well aware of the critical role that plants play in the balance of nature, from the kelp in our oceans to the grasses on the plains to the trees in our forests. Plants are the very foundation of every ecosystem on Earth, cleaning our air, filtering our water, holding soil in place, sequestering carbon, and feeding our wildlife and all of us. Native plants are a specific category of plant. It includes both large canopy and understory trees, shrubs, vines, grasses, and more. They're indigenous to an area and have unique growing habits, having evolved over thousands of years in a specific geographic region, alongside local flora and fauna without the involvement of man, but rather in sync with the wildlife that they support. And native plants are by far the best food source for the critical pollinators who've evolved alongside them, the birds, bees, bats, and butterflies who work very hard to keep the complex biodiversity of our ecosystems in balance. And lest you think these critters are simply appealing, please know that without them, 80% of our food would disappear. No pollinators certainly means no flowers, but it also means no apples or almonds or wheat or tomatoes or cucumbers or pumpkins or watermelon, etc. Tough for us, but very, very tough for all the creatures we share the earth with. All plants are hard workers, but native plants are extremely high performers. For a small upfront investment, you get a very high return. Using native plants is more efficient and less expensive in the long run for the following reasons. Their seeds are readily available. They do not require the use of expensive fertilizers to boost them along when they're planted, where they're locally adapted. Their plant chemistry already knows how to fight off the bad bugs, and therefore they don't require pesticides or even herbicides to keep them healthy. And because these extra steps aren't needed, they demand less time on the part of our growers and caretakers. And once they're established, most native plants are drought resistant, using far less water than non-native or invasive plants, a critical point in our increasingly warm climate. The introduction and widespread use of non-native plants like the kind you can readily buy at your local nursery has severely upset the balance of our planet's biodiversity. Many non-native plants are also highly invasive, choking out the good plants. We cannot simply substitute exotic non-native plants without damaging the wildlife and the ecosystems. And today, over one-third of North American native species, including insects, caterpillars, birds, and other animals, are at risk of extinction. And there are many reasons for this, not the least of which is that native species cannot eat non-native plants, and yet that is increasingly all they can find. In order to support wildlife, to protect the biodiversity of our ecosystems, and to improve the health of our planet, we need to adopt policies that promote the use of native plants on our public lands and in our communities. And what better place to start than in our national parks? HR 1548 sets up a win-win situation by empowering our skilled and experienced Park Service employees to propagate the native plant materials specific to their park's ecosystem, nurture those plants, and then plant the best ones throughout the parks, launching a healing process that's critical to a thriving ecosystem. The 5-year pilot programs established by this legislation can inform a government-wide approach to the use of native plant species. It's our great hope and expectation that as a result of HR 1548, we'll see an enormous increase in the native plant use across all our public lands. For all these reasons, the Garden Club of America asks that you support HR 1548 and by extension to encourage the use of native plants wherever and whenever possible. It's my understanding that in some native languages, the word for plants translates to those who take care of us. This is an opportunity for us to take care of the plants. Thank you again for your commitment, and I look forward to answering any questions and to being a resource for the committee as it moves forward with this visionary and important legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. Margaret Everson, Executive Director of the Oak Grove Initiative.
Thank you, Chairman Neguse, Ranking Member Fulcher, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the Lodge and Pax Acts, and I have submitted my full testimony for the record. Nearly 30 years ago, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist and environmentalist Wallace Stager proclaimed, "The national parks are the best idea we ever had. Absolutely American, absolutely democratic. They reflect us at our best rather than at our worst." This often cited quote is as appropriate now as when Stager first said it. But today, significant challenges exist across the national park system that must be addressed to sustain these iconic, essential places. Facility maintenance and backlogs, equitable resource management, and National Park Service employee housing must be prioritized to ensure visitors have the same solace and respite in these special places as those that came before them. And now, as throughout history, Congress is again considering offering support to address ongoing challenges within the national park system through the Lodge and Pax Acts, intended to look at ways to provide additional tools to support safe and affordable housing for Park Service employees and expand opportunities to partner across the park system. I am incredibly humbled to have worked at the Department of the Interior for nearly 10 years during 2 separate tours, most recently when I had the opportunity to lead both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. Currently, I serve as the Executive Director of the Oak Grove Initiative, where we make recommendations to help government agencies improve their internal processes and policies to better distribute funds to support communities while delivering conservation, recreation, and natural resource benefits. Throughout its history, finding safe, cost-effective, and available housing for Park Service employees has been a challenge. These hardships are increasingly affecting employee morale, and several parks are having severe impacts in hiring and retention and on operations generally. While serving as the acting director at NPS, I visited Mount Rainier to see firsthand some of the housing challenges it faced. While meeting with employees living in parks housing units, they told stories about previously having to stuff pillows into the cracks that had developed in the walls to keep the night chill at bay. This was unacceptable then and remains unacceptable today. During my time with the department, I was fortunate to be on Secretary Bernhardt's team that initiated and implemented a major multi-million-dollar housing investment effort at Yellowstone National Park that substantially upgraded NPS housing. This 2-year project, still successfully underway, demolished and replaced trailers in poor condition with high-quality modular housing, including at one of the most remote locations, Bachelor in Idaho. But superintendents and NPS leadership have been quick to caution against implementing short-term fixes that would create a cycle of quickly deteriorating housing that add to ever-increasing maintenance backlog. We agree and look forward to working with the National Park Service on durable policies that consider an approach that addresses the housing issue holistically. The Oak Grove Initiative supports the scope of the Lodge Act and its intent to maximize partnership opportunities and provide clear language supporting public-private partnerships to increase the availability of safe and affordable housing within proximity and within national parks. The bill would increase flexibility to enter into these innovating housing partnerships, which are similar to the ones other federal agencies have used successfully, including the Department of Defense. We support the Lodge Act and its goals to allow parks to fund housing projects off NPS property in coordination with community partners, exploring alternatives to in-park housing while developing a model that would create incentives for companies to invest in these projects. Specifically, we appreciate the approach that allows maximum flexibility to work with traditional and new partners to address employee housing, and we appreciate that the bill recognizes the potential to partner with similarly challenged federal agencies and support a holistic solution to the housing challenges. As drafted, we would welcome the opportunity to provide small improvements to the legislation. In addition to language currently in the bill addressing sustainable maintenance, we would recommend a preference for working with entities that, in addition to building new units and refurbishing existing structures, also undertake the continued maintenance of these housing units. The Oak Grove Initiative supports the intent of the Pax Act to expand the ability of the National Park Service to enter into a range of cooperative management agreements to solve its current challenges. The cooperative management agreement model will particularly support facilities maintenance professionals with a myriad of operation conditions that they face. As drafted, the new language adds tribal governments and quasi-governmental entities to organizations that could enter into cooperative management agreements, and we would support expanding this section to even broader authorities that include non-federal entities, including institutes of higher education, nonprofit, and private organizations. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Everson. The chair now recognizes Ms. Patrice Hortzman, Chair of the Board of Supervisors in Coconino County, Arizona. I hope I pronounced that right. You are recognized, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Chair Nagus, Ranking Member Folker, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for holding today's legislative hearing on H.R. 6442, the Pax Act, and H.R. 7615, the Lodge Act, and for inviting me to testify on behalf of the National Association of Counties, NACO, and the nation's 3,069 counties. My name is Patrice Horstman. I serve as the chair of the Coconino County, Arizona Board of Supervisors. Through my years of experience in local government, I know very well the challenges in public land counties face as we seek to provide the best services possible to residents and public land visitors. Coconino County serves as a gateway to Grand Canyon National Park, Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, and multiple national forests and national monuments. Private land makes up approximately 13% of our county, making our economy heavily reliant on tourism and recreation to our surrounding public lands. The Grand Canyon annually hosts over 6 million visitors and supports approximately 12,000 local jobs. My testimony focuses on the need to build a cooperative agreements between federal agencies and non-federal partners. This is to maintain critical infrastructure and support the development of affordable housing for the National Park Service employees and for private renters. H.R. 6442 and H.R. 7615 would help solve some of these problems. The Pax Act would allow the Secretary of the Interior to enter into cooperative management agreements with tribal governments and quasi-government entities. NPS currently has the ability to enter into these agreements with state and local governments. It expands this ability. Cooperative local agreements can help the NPS to tackle its $21.8 billion in deferred maintenance costs. The NPS simply cannot meet these costs on its own. with many NPS facilities have fallen into disrepair. New authorities granted by the Pax Act will bring other innovative partnerships and approaches to meet NPS management needs and to reduce costs. Our counties applaud Congressman Fulker for introducing this legislation. Coconino County has also built a strong relationship with Grand Canyon National Park. We provide search and rescue services at no cost to NPS, which costs our county over $250,000 annually. Rapidly rising housing costs in gateway communities, especially in light of the pandemic, have significantly strained the ability of federal land agencies and private sector employees to recruit and to retain personnel. Many more property owners now rent their homes to short-term visitors rather than to NPS staff or local private sector employees. With these properties being snatched up by investors, Arizona's home prices have surged statewide by 9.1% in 2022 and an additional 22% in 2021. With this increase in home prices comes increase in rental housing. In Coconino County, we see the consequences of inaction regarding housing for public service staff. Job candidates to the Grand Canyon sometimes decline positions because they would have to live in Flagstaff 70 miles away. It is not only the distance, but also the availability of affordable housing here in Flagstaff and throughout the region that makes it difficult for many candidates to accept positions with the NPS. While the NPS has the authority to enter into public-private housing, current law makes this unattractive to the private sector. The Lodge Act would help alleviate this issue by giving NPS new authorities to develop employee and non-employee housing on off-federal lands through new partnerships with federal and non-federal entities. The Lodge Act reduces the cost for taxpayers and increases the supply of affordable housing. Chairman Agus, Ranking Member Fulker, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of our nation's public land counties and in support of both the Pax Act and the Lodge Act. I appreciate being here this morning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The chair now recognizes Dr. Hadia Sewer, President and co-founder of the St. John Heritage Collective.
Thank you, and good day, Chairman Agus, Ranking Member Fulcher, and other esteemed members of the subcommittee. I would like to thank Congresswoman Plaskett for putting forward this bill. I am Dr. Hadia Sewer, the president and co-founder of St. Janko, the St. John Heritage Collective, and a visiting scholar in the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to submit an oral statement in support of H.R. 7496, a bill that aims to install a plaque at the peak of the Ram Head Trail, which is affectionately called Ram's Head by the ancestral people of St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands, formerly St. John, Danish West Indies. The Ram Head Trail is situated in the Virgin Islands National Park, located in St. John, and the bill aims to commemorate the 1733 rebellion against slavery that took place there. On November 23rd, 1733, enslaved African and Afro-Caribbean people on St. John made courageous steps towards securing their freedom and altering the political and economic systems of the then Danish West Indies, the wider Caribbean, and the modern world. On that morning, the rebels, who the people of St. John prefer to refer to as revolutionaries, concealed knives and bundles of wood, approached Fredericksburn and Coral Bay, St. John, killed 6 of the soldiers stationed there, and commenced the rebellion. In this act of organized resistance, the freedom fighters took and maintained control over the island of St. John for approximately 8 months before the rebellion was quelled. We do not know the names of everyone who participated in the 1733 resistance against slavery. Archives are often created and maintained by people in positions of power and do not often center the voices and experiences of the most marginalized people, namely the enslaved and the rebel fighters. Nevertheless, it is important to recognize the ingenuity and the bravery of the people who resisted their enslavement and sought self-determination. Some of their names are Asari, Brefu, Christian, Class, Kofi, Kantampa, Goliath, Mingo, Philip, Piero, Kwahi, Prince Vanja, Samba, and Scipio. And their ideologies and justice-oriented actions contributed to the decline of the Danish West Indian economy and inspired subsequent acts of resistance in nearby islands. What we know about the 1733 rebellion against slavery is drawn from the scholarship, advocacy, creative works, oral history, and culture bearing of individuals such as Dr. Gilbert Sproul, Professor Jean Emanuel, John Anderson, Dr. Holly Norton, and the community groups and everyday people who take an interest in St. John's history and are deeply invested in transmitting knowledge in both formal and informal capacities. The site of the rebellion, Frederiksvarn, is commonly referred to as Fortsburg, and Dr. Gilbert Sproul, alongside local community organizations, hold an annual 1733 Fortsburg history tour in November to educate the public and commemorate Freedom Fighters Day, a Virgin Islands holiday. The proposed plaque would help to acknowledge and amplify the work that is currently being done to uncover and disseminate knowledge about the territory's history. The plaque also situates the 1733 rebellion in territorial, national, regional, and global discourses on slavery and its aftermaths by highlighting its significance. By resisting their captivity and dehumanization, the enslaved Africans and Afro-Caribbean people of the 1733 rebellion chose their humanization, clearly articulating their profound and unquenched desires for freedom in the face of anti-Black terror. Enslavers created entire social orders, political systems, and systems of knowledge to justify chattel slavery, settler colonial logic, and the extraction of wealth that takes place under racial capitalism. And in resisting slavery, the freedom fighters helped to refine the democratic ideals of the modern world's political systems. In the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah Jones writes, "It would be historically inaccurate to reduce the contributions of Black people to the vast material wealth created by our bondage. Black Americans have also been and continue to be foundational to the idea of American freedom," end quote. And so it's important that we commemorate the 1733 rebellion, because history is not merely about what happened in the past, it is also about the ways that narratives are framed and deployed in the interest of power. Our public memory reveals a great deal about who we are as a people and who we are becoming. And when we learn about the liberation struggles of historically marginalized people, we are doing our part to perfect democracy. The Ramhead Trail is an appropriate location for the plaque because it is both the location where some of the rebels camped during their bid for sovereignty and also the location where they opted to commit suicide rather than allowing themselves to be recaptured. A plaque in the Virgin Islands National Park will, 1, honor their legacy, 2, provide public education, and 3, improve visitors' experiences. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Mr. Will Shafroth, Coloradan, and the president and CEO of the National Park Foundation for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Fulcher, other members of the committee. My name is Will Shafroth. I'm the president and CEO of the National Park Foundation. On behalf of the Foundation's board of directors and all those who love America's treasured spaces, thank you for the committee for holding this hearing and considering H.R. 7693, the National Park Foundation Reauthorization Act of 2022. I would thank Congresswoman DeGette for her unpaid commercial message on behalf of the Foundation earlier today. Chartered by Congress in 1967, the Foundation was founded on a legacy that began more than a century ago when private citizens from all walks of life acted to establish and protect our national parks. Today, the Foundation carries on that tradition as the only charitable organization whose mission is to directly support the National Park Service. Working together with the National Park Service and a very dedicated community of park partners, the Foundation strives to preserve what's best about our national parks and ensure that all people can connect with and enjoy our national parks. The success of the Foundation is tied directly to the financial support provided by individuals, families, foundations, and corporations. In fiscal year 21, for instance, that support totaled $128 million. The impact associated with those funds included connecting more than 184,000, mostly Title I fourth graders to our parks, maintaining and restoring more than 900 miles of park trails, modernizing campgrounds and trails, and investing in Service Corps crews that completed over 60,000 hours of service at more than 50 national parks. One reason for the growth of the Foundation's fundraising over the recent years is the addition of federal appropriations that were authorized in the National Park Service Centennial Act, which was enacted in 2016. The Centennial Act authorized the foundation to receive up to $5 million in annual appropriations through fiscal '23. This annual appropriation requires the foundation to provide a minimum of a dollar-for-dollar match for NPS programs and projects. During fiscal 18, 19, and 20, the foundation received a total of $13 million in federal funds, which it matched with approximately $15.2 million in private funds, creating a total impact on our parks of over $28 million. While the FY21 appropriated funds are not yet fully allocated, the foundation is matching these funds at greater than a 1-to-1 ratio. To date, the foundation has invested the appropriated funds to fund more than 100 projects in 32 states and 2 territories. By the end of fiscal 2023, it is the foundation's goal to have funded projects in all 50 states and multiple territories with the appropriated funds. The foundation staff works closely with both the Park Service leadership across the park system as well as local partners to identify priority programs and projects where investing appropriated funds can leverage private dollars and vice versa. The private dollars are often looking to match their dollars with federal funds as well. The types of projects that have been funded to date include rehabilitating trails, visitor centers, and other facilities, deploying service corps to build and maintain trails, eradicate invasive species and restore historic structures, engaging and connecting youth, conserving wildlife and their habitat, expanding sustainability efforts, and restoring and improving historic and cultural resources. These funds have proven critical in addressing the park's deferred maintenance backlog, making our parks more resilient and sustainable, and increasing access for current and future generations of park visitors. With increased visitation in parks and a continued gap in funding between the needs and available funding across the park system, the National Park Foundation Reauthorization Act could not come at a better time. H.R. 7693 would reauthorize the foundation's annual appropriation through fiscal year 30 and increase the authorized amount from $5 million to $15 million. The foundation is confident that we can continue to raise substantial private funds to more than double the federal investment in park programs and projects. Should this reauthorization happen as proposed, the annual impact on the parks would exceed $30 million. These federal funds will help NPF to raise funds by showing its donors that federal government is a strong partner in supporting our treasured national parks. The foundation's goal in this fiscal year is to raise a total of more than $150 million to support our parks. So having the authorization extended through fiscal year 30 and increase to $15 million will really put the wind in our sails as it continues to help the already great national parks be even greater. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, other members of this committee, and other members of the House and the Senate for sponsoring this bill. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shafroth, for your testimony. The chair will recognize the ranking member, Mr. Fulcher, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to start with a couple of questions for Ms. Horstman, please. Ms. Horstman, thank you for your testimony. And I understand that Coconino County is an important gateway for iconic destinations like Grand Canyon National Park. And Ms. Horstman, can you tell me, has your community been impacted by the current inflation and gas prices as that gateway community?
Yes, Congressman, we have, needless to say, like many Americans, on high gas prices, it certainly affects not only our mobility and our travel, certainly families who are planning their summer vacations may think twice, and that is going to affect my local community and the restaurants in my area, and certainly Grand Canyon National Park. So yes, we do feel what most of Americans are feeling right now with the increase in gas prices.
Let's shift gears just a little bit, and I'd like to talk to you about something else that you mentioned in your testimony. You'd mentioned several ways that Coconino County has already partnered with the National Park Service in the past. And I think there's a reference to saving some money on some critical services. Have you taken a look at this, one of the bills on the docket today, the Pax Act, and about increasing partnerships with local and tribal communities? And what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there is some promise to opening that up to some public-private partnerships.
Oh, absolutely. And, as you know, here in Coconino County, we also encompass a part of both the Navajo and Hopi Reservation. And this also allows us to enter into partnerships and collaborations with our tribal entities as well. And an example of being able to do that, the Grand Canyon National Park is home to 11 indigenous tribes. And this allows the Grand Canyon to work with many of these tribes to provide interpreter services, to also basically partner with the tribes to come to the parks to provide services to Grand Canyon National Park as well, which help the experience of the visitors and certainly also are part of our community here in Coconino County and on our tribal neighbors.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Horstman. I appreciate that. I'd like to shift over to Ms. Everson, please. And thank you for your testimony, for being here today. You noted in your testimony that you believe that the authority in the Pax Act could be expanded even further. And it currently does not include institution of higher education, for example, and nonprofit private organizations. But share just a little bit more about that. What do you think the benefits would be of even expanding that further?
Thank you very much for the question. I appreciate it. I think this issue's come up time and again during this hearing today. The Park Service has a substantial number of challenges. We've heard about backlog and maintenance, which was addressed in part by the Great American Outdoors Act. We've heard about challenges to housing. We've heard about challenges to roads and bridges and campgrounds. There are a lot of things that the National Park Service has faced in terms of challenges today. And the authorities that have been laid out in the Pax Act with the ability to find a greater range of partners to help address some of these authorities. When you're looking particularly at maintenance professionals and being able to give them more tools to being able to address some of these problems. You look at snow removal, for example, at Rocky Mountain National Park, being able to enter into agreements with the county, but also being able to enter into agreements perhaps with local contractors to be able to address and solve that problem. We've seen things here in the city being able, Franklin Square, being able to work with bids, for example, the National Park Service being able to work with bids to solve a significant challenge. There may be smaller squares and circles around Washington, D.C., where you could have local restaurants or local businesses that may want to partner together, 2 or 3, to take on some of those challenges. So I think really looking institutes of higher education, I think you've seen some great innovative thinking. I think being able to expand those tools are really important when you look at being able to give the Park Service, particularly the maintenance workers, all the tools that they need to solve this problem.
Thank you for your insight. Again, Ms. Everson, we used up my time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. We're good. Yeah, thanks.
All right, gentleman yields back. Chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes of questions. And I would say first, thank you to all of the witnesses for testifying today on the bills that are before the committee. To Mr. Shafroth, of course, as I said from the outset of this hearing, we couldn't be more excited about the work that the National Park Foundation has done and will continue to do. And I am grateful to the ranking member of the full committee for bringing forward the reauthorization and recognizing the need for us to increase the funding associated with that reauthorization. And I wonder if you might talk a bit, you discussed this during the course of your testimony, but maybe you could expound upon it a little bit. H.R. 7693, the bill that reauthorizes the National Park Foundation, of course, envisions much more substantial funding. Not enough in my view, but it's a step in the right direction. And I wonder what activities, what projects you believe would see the greatest benefit if that piece of legislation that we're considering today makes it across the finish line and gets to the president's desk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. A couple of different categories, I would say. One is that we're seeing a dramatic increase in the interest in using service corps to help the Park Service and frankly other public land management agencies to address some of the significant issues they're facing by providing really a lower cost alternative to the public agencies for addressing some of the issues around trail development and restoration. It could be historic preservation related to work on some of the historic structures in these places. So that's one area. Another one is significant investments that the Park Service needs to make in its infrastructure, not just deferred maintenance, but improvements. Notwithstanding some recent decline in visitation, the parks in general are continuing to be more popular. We've seen that, and one of the reasons for declining visitation was that a lot of the places have been closed for significant portions of the year or completely closed. So I only see an increase in visitation forward. So we need to help think about additional capacity. And so in some cases, bringing these private funds forward to match with the federal dollars is going to allow an acceleration of that work to happen, so that the visitors can be receive those improved visitor services or amenities in a much quicker time frame. We've already been doing that in some regards with some new visitor centers at Little Bighorn and Bering Bridge, for example, where we're bringing private dollars to move something much more quickly to the finish line than otherwise would have happened. So I see that's the kind of thinking happen. And then finally, one of the areas that we continue to be focused on is engaging our young people in our parks. We need to make sure that the next generation of people in our country, citizens, understand and appreciate these great places, so they become the next generation of stewards and champions for these places.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And again, grateful for the work that the National Park Foundation is doing, and all the more reason for us to get this reauthorization done in an as expeditiously, manner, or in as expeditious as a manner as we can over the course of the coming weeks. So I thank you, and I thank all the witnesses for their testimony. And before we conclude with this witness panel, we'll simply ask one more time whether there are any members who have not had their 5 minutes and would seek recognition to ask questions now. No one joining us virtually. With that, I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of this committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses. We will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, subparagraph O, members of this committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.